brilliant. Anyway, it's really great to be here with all of you. I feel like we're already getting to know you as a group because we've already worked together. And I think that's what's so important. Let me just say that I was really flattered when Reinhard reached out to me because he had read my book and he told me about Patrick and his family's story. And it's a real honor to be allied with someone who's such a visionary and not only is talking the talk, but is walking the walk and building on Saol and not only helping people locally in the Dublin area and in Ireland, but also working on the broader question of human rights. And this really is a human rights question. So I'm going to share my screen and let's see if that works and talk. And it's going to be a talk about covert consciousness and the right to care, bringing disability rights to the clinic. And I was going to give a different talk than the one that I decided to give, but Terry Wallace died on March 29th. And I don't know how many of you have heard of Terry Wallace, but Terry Wallace was a man who had been in a car accident in 1984. And then he woke up in 2003 and started talking, and they thought he had been vegetative all along. But in fact, he had been in what we now know as the minimally conscious state. And I got to know Terry, he came to Cornell, I interviewed his family, I met Terry. We did scans of Terry, and he died on March 29th. And so I'm going to frame this talk around his life and death. And I want to dedicate this talk to his memory and his legacy, which is so incredibly important. You'll see here that, he had an obituary in the New York Times, which is something most of us are probably not going to have. So he had a very consequential life. And I want to tell the story and the challenges of covert consciousness and disability rights through the prismatic of his life, which in many ways was extraordinary and in many ways was way too ordinary. So Terry shows how far we've come and how far we still have to go. So in 1984, he was in a car accident and he was left in a coma. There are all kinds of phrases, as you all know, there's a lot of definitional obscurity, coma, vegetative state, minimally conscious state, and the like. And then on July 11, 2003, 19 years later, when he was in what's euphemistically called custodial care in a nursing home, he started to talk. First words were mom, and then he said Pepsi, which is his favorite drink. He developed greater fluency, but he was trapped in time. Ronald Reagan was still president. It was still in his mind, 1984. And everybody thought he had been vegetative, but review of his medical record and in discussions, which Angeli Wallace's mom, who's in this picture, and whose family has given me permission to write about him in the book and to talk about his subsequent life. It turns out that he was in the minimally conscious state for most of that time. And he'd been unassessed by a neurologist for 19 years, according to Jerry, his father, because it was too expensive, it wouldn't matter. People like him don't get it better, and in fact, until 2002, there was no category for the minimally conscious state. So he developed contractures, and as his mind was getting better, his body was deteriorating. But in 2009, he told his mama, life is good, okay? So what strikes me, and I wanna just give this haunting image because I think it kind of captures the challenge, was what happened in 1993, 10 years before he started, before he woke up. And a nurse's aide called Mrs. Wallace up and said, Terry's not right. Now, if you're vegetative, you're not right or wrong. You're just supposed to be unconscious, right? But there had been some overnight events, which little trigger warning here, disturbing. He had been in a nursing home with an elderly person who had dementia, and the person who had dementia was strangulated and died because he strangled himself because of his agitation in his sheets. It was all discovered, and the nurse's aide who was attending to Terry and his roommate thought that Terry seemed to be upset. And this is what Mrs. Wallace told me in my book, Rights Come to Mind. One of the aides called me from work one morning and told me she was not supposed to do that, kind of civil disobedience by the nurses, right? that man had passed away that night and that it had bothered Terry. And I needed to be down there. And when she arrived, Terry was lying there with his eyes open wide. He would not go to sleep. I mean, he was making no noise at the time, but I stayed there with him most all the day until he finally went to sleep. So I don't know what he saw, but I know he saw something. And I know it had, and she says, now, this is after he starts talking. She says, now I knew then it had to be something that was really bad. So Terry, who was thought to be vegetative in 1993, saw what happened in his room, was unable to express himself. As they say in the Broadway play Hamilton, he was in the room where it happened, but nobody knew he was there. Nobody knew he was there. He had covert consciousness, but the nurse's aide intuited something's wrong. And in retrospect, Angela Wallace knew that Terry had the capacity because he subsequently started talking. And the minimally conscious state is a state of intermittent and episodic awareness of self, others, and environment. And these are aspen trees from Colorado. And this is the aspen criteria that describes it in this state of patients who have awareness of self, others, and the environment. They can reach for a cup, they can say their name, they can look up when you come into the room. But the challenge is they don't do it regularly and consistently. And so they're often misdiagnosed. 41% of patients with traumatic brain injury in nursing homes, according to Carolyn Schnacker's work, who were thought to be in the vegetative state, were actually on closer evaluation in the minimally conscious state. So these are people who are conscious versus people who are unconscious. And the basic punchline of this discussion here, or the bumper sticker, is what we say here in the United States, something that could fit on the back of a car. The bumper sticker is, if you're conscious, your rights deserve to be recognized, and your consciousness needs to be recognized, and it needs to be fostered. Okay, so one of the things that has happened over the last 20, 30 years is how important technology has been to understanding this. And I want to just read the first line of this chapter that I wrote as an epilogue to the Oxford Handbook of Neuroethics. I said, if there's a unifying theme to neuroethics in this anthology, it's the predominance of technology. Neuroethics is both made necessary by technology and utterly dependent upon it without resort to hyperbole. It can be said that neuroethics is essentially an ethics of technology. And what technology has done is that it reveals problems and it also suggests solutions to problems. And here is that relationship, right? So we'll talk about studies that were done at Cambridge and that showed a patient who was thought to be vegetative being able to do this study where they said, imagine playing tennis in your head. Imagine walking through your house, spatial navigation. And then toggling, this is a separate study, toggling those responses to yes, no, communication. So here you see the technology revealing the inside of someone's abilities, right? Overtly at the bedside, these patients are in the vegetative state. They're non-responsive. But when you ask them to do something volitionally, you ask them to imagine doing something, right? Not a passive task, but an active task. They activate the tennis area. Imagine playing tennis. Imagine walking through your house. So, and then you see here in the bottom slide, toggling that awareness of a problem of covert consciousness to a way to remedy it or deal with it is to say, if you're imagining playing tennis, if you want to say yes, imagine playing tennis. If you want to say no, imagine walking through your house. And all of a sudden, the technology reveals a problem, it solves a problem. And here you have the image of the work that we did using deep brain stimulation to give somebody who was in the minimally conscious state the ability to communicate. So it really is about technology, revealing a problem and then offering solutions to that problem. So neuroethics really is an ethics of technology. Where does our study begin? Where does our discussion begin? It really begins in this realm of disorders of consciousness. And this is the work of Brian Jeanette, a Scottish neurosurgeon, and Fred Plum, who was my teacher. And in 1972, they wrote the paper describing the persistent vegetative state. They called it a syndrome in search of a name. And this was a state of wakeful unresponsiveness. Great phrase, right? The eyes were open, but there was no awareness of self, others, or the environment. And this was followed by its importance. And this is where we get into some trouble, right? And how that information was used. And it was used in the United States. And again, I'm giving an American, North American centric talk, but a lot of this is generalizable. Having talked to Reinhard, I know some of the problems you encounter in Ireland and in Europe and in the EU are similar to the problems that we've encountered here. But the vegetative state became prominent in the United States because of its linkage to Karen Ann Quinlan, who was a woman who was in the vegetative state. And this established the right to die, the negative right to be left alone, very central to bioethics, which was predicated on the evolution of self-determination and autonomy. And the right to die, and this is so important, in the United States was established in severe brain injury because care was perceived to be futile. And in the judge's decision in New Jersey Supreme Court said that the withdrawal of care was justified because of her loss of her cognitive sapient state. And here's a picture of Dr. Plum in 1976 and Judge Hughes, who was the chief judge of the New Jersey Supreme Court. He says, indicated by Dr. Plum, the brain works in essentially two ways, the vegetative and the sapient. So the vegetative is the lower part of the brain, the brainstem, and the sapient is the cortical part of the brain. And we have no hesitancy deciding that no external compelling interest of the state should compel Karen to endure the unendurable. Interesting, if you're vegetative, how do you endure anything? But we'll give him partial credit because it was 1976, only to vegetate a few more measurable months with no realistic possibility of returning to any semblance of cognitive or sapient life. So the fact that it was futile, it was enduring, no one gets better from this, became the justification to allow for the withdrawal of the ventilator. And this was an earlier book I wrote about palliative care, that physicians after Quinlan became acculturated to the right to die. The vegetative state became the ultimate in medical futility. Nothing could or should be done. And these injuries were immutable. The brain in the vegetative state, if you actually look at the autopsy results from Quinlan, her brain had basically liquefied. It weighed half of a normal brain. She had what's called hydrocephalus ex vacuo. The ventricles expanded. There was no cortex to speak of, and it was not a brain that could sustain consciousness. And this held in this notion of futility in the Cruzan case, which went to the Supreme Court, and the Terry Schiavo case, which gained notoriety in the United States in 2005. But at the same time, we're talking about the futility of the vegetative state. There were these strange cases of patients who would wake up after 3 or 5 or 19 years, and there was another group that were, in neurology, we talk about the neglect syndrome, when you don't see half of your visual field, but you don't know they're there because you've got a neglect syndrome. Well, we had a kind of a societal neglect syndrome. There were patients who looked just like they were vegetative, but in fact they weren't. They were the minimally conscious patients who looked vegetative, but in fact were conscious. And what happened, and this is an argument that I made in the book, was that we generalized this notion of futility to all severe brain injury. And in interviewing at that point in this book, some 50 families, at least in the United States, they, after receiving brilliant acute care treatment and from surgery and the ICUs and all that, families encountered a disinterested healthcare system, the presumption that you're not going to get better, neglect, a static view of brain injury, and not dynamic, notwithstanding scientific evidence to the contrary. And you see about early decisions to withhold or withdraw life-sustaining therapy, patients being approached to be organ donors and the like, and premature palliative care recommendations, which were, I have nothing against palliative care. I wrote a book on palliative care, but it's got to be for the right patient at the right time in the right place, and people getting discharged to nursing homes that were not equipped to take care of their medical complications. And here's a kind of a capturing of that sort of nihilism and almost paternalism that we see in doctors around 2007. This is from Dr. Vijix, who runs the ICU, the neuro ICU at the Mayo Clinic. And this is a talk called the Family Conference, End of Life Guidelines at Work for Comatose Patients. Now, let me just say, Coma is a self-limited state of 2 weeks. So this is something, you know, all this within 2 weeks. So this is a 2-week recommendation. And this is what he wrote in Neurology. Okay, remember that journal, because we'll come back to Neurology, which is the official journal of the American Academy of Neurology. The attending physician of a patient with a devastating neurologic illness will have to come to terms with the futility of care. Those families who are unconvinced should be explicitly told they should have markedly diminished expectations about what ICU care can accomplish, and that withdrawal of life support or abstaining from performing more complex interventions is more commensurate with the neurologic status. It's very prescriptive, it's very premature, it's very paternalistic. And as this was happening, we have had over the last 20 years or so a golden age of neuroscience, when we understand that actually our expectations should be a little different, that in fact patients do get better, that things do change in the brain. And I want to, briefly now turn to some of that scientific evidence that would suggest that we needed to have a frame shift and a new view of these things. So this is a paper that we did at Cornell, just showing the heterogeneity of the vegetative state. These are 5 patients we published in Brain who were all clinically vegetative. These 2 in D&E were people who had cardiac arrest, who had a noxic brain injury. And these 3 on this left panel had traumatic brain injury. And clinically, they were all the same, overtly. But you see here, this is, if you look at the scale here, purple and blue is low metabolic activity, and red is normal, red orange normal metabolic activity. And you see here, these are people who had sustained a kind of a global anoxic injury from the cardiac arrest. And you see variability here in these 3 patients had traumatic brain injury. And you also see here a patient who's got a lot of residual cortical activity, but in fact had an injury to the thalamus that basically took out the integrative function of the brain. And we're learning more and more about the importance of the thalamus as an integrative function. I mean, when I give this talk, I say that Atlanta is the hub for Delta Airlines, but let's just say Frankfurt is the hub for Lufthansa, right? And you can't get anywhere in Europe without going through Frankfurt. And the brain is organized with the thalamus as the hub. There's cortico-thalamo-cortical tracts, and the brain communicates with itself by going through the thalamus or making connections in Frankfurt. And so if you have a pinpoint injury in the thalamus and take out your thalamus, you disintegrate the brain. And not disintegration, but disintegration. The brain is not working as an integrated function, and that loses the ability for consciousness. And that we'll come back to that, because that in part was the thesis for our work with deep brain stimulation. Continuing the theme of disintegration, this is a study that Stephen Lories did in Liège. And he looked at controls, normal patients, and people who were at the vegetative state. And he did some nail bed compression, and he showed that the cortical processing of noxious stimuli revealed that people in the vegetative state only had activation here of the primary sensory area in red, but blue is the lack of activation in the pain network. So they lose their network response. They lose their ability to integrate the brain and work as a unit, whereas the normals have the full sweep of the pain network. This is a study that was done here at Cornell in a patient who was in the minimally conscious state, and it basically showed that patients in the minimally conscious state could process language, even though overtly they weren't necessarily responding to language. And I wrote, I was quoted in the New York Times by Ben Carey on the front page of the New York Times during the Shivo debate, because that was in the news. And I said, this study gave me goosebumps. They actually published that, because it shows this possibility of this profound isolation, that these people are there, that they've been there all along, even though we've been treating them as if they're not. So they processed language. So when you played a tape forward and played it backwards as language and as gibberish, they responded to the language, not to the gibberish. So they're processing language and syntax and words and content, which means they're in the room. They're in the room, but we didn't know that they were there. So that was really revelatory. And then we see these 2 studies that I've already told you about, continuing this notion of covert consciousness. This is a paper that Adrian Owen published in Science in 2006. Imagine playing tennis, imagine walking through your house. But it was a bit of a disingenuous title because it's detecting awareness in the vegetative state. If the vegetative state is defined as a state of wakeful unresponsiveness, right? But they're responding, how could you be in the vegetative state? And I wrote at the time some articles saying these people were in the minimally conscious state. They had covert consciousness, but they weren't vegetative. And here you see in the New England Journal of Medicine, members of that same team toggling these responses to yes, no. So here you see the problem, and here you see the technology remedying that problem. And here's an image from Terry Wallace himself, the man I started talking about. This is 19 years or so after his brain injury. And you see how devastating his injury was. This is what's called diffusion tensor imaging scan. And I want you to focus on the red fibers here. This is the front of his head. This is the back of his head. And this red thing here is his corpus callosum, and which is the white matter tracts that connect the right and left hemispheres. And what you see is how little is left in the middle. And these fibers, the red fibers, go left to right and right to left. They cross, they go that way. But what I want you to focus on here is posteriorly, he's got this big blob of red in his posterior occipital lobe, parietal occipital lobe. And then 19 months later, it disappears. And you see new fibers kind of creeping up here in the cerebellum. And what this was is possible axonal regrowth, that is, new fibers between remaining neurons as having something to do with his late recovery. So the brain, 19 years plus after injury, was rewiring itself. And what this process is, and this to me is the most exciting thing, this notion of sprouting and pruning of neurons is what happens in Catherine just nodded, she knows where this is headed. This is what happens in babies and children. This is how the brain develops. So what we have here is a developmental process being reharnessed in the service of repair after a long period of latency. But this was just a snapshot. And we subsequently did a similar study at Cornell with Maggie Worthen, who is as Reinhardt will tell you, is the main character in Rights Come to Mind. And here is instead of a snapshot, a longitudinal study of Maggie's brain over 54 months. This is Maggie and her mom, Nancy, over 54 months, showing increased white matter connections across the hemispheres and in Broca's area. And over this period of time, Maggie, using an eye tracking machine, was able to communicate with 90% accuracy. She couldn't do that at the beginning, but as her brain developed and changed and she developed new connections, she was able to sustain that. So local changes in her network contributed to recovery of a communication ability. So that led to okay, what does that mean for policy? What does that mean? And so up at Yale with my fellow at the time, now she's a colleague and she teaches at Penn State, Megan Wright and I wrote a paper, and this was an idea that was also in my book, that we should think about rehabilitation not as rehabilitation, but as education. If the childhood developing brain takes 18 years or so to mature, and we bring them to school for a decade and a half for education, and it takes years for the injured brain to recovery, then you shouldn't get three sessions a week for 3 weeks and call that, you're done, rehabilitation. Instead, we should think of it as longitudinal and as education. And I don't know if you could see this little cartoon here, but these are the little brains that are in school playing, and the kids are doing their Descartes, I think, therefore I am, ergo, they're not quite getting it right. But the idea here is that we should use what we learn in neuroscience and translate it into policy, and neurorehabilitation should be thought of more as education than as habilitación, of returning somebody back to work. And this is a paper I wrote in Archives of Neurology. And basically the punchline is brains recover by biological mechanism, not reimbursement criteria. We should follow the science, not how much money politicians want to give us. And part of that is realizing that there's a tremendous amount of potentiality and promise in the injured brain. And there was a Spanish neurophysiologist, Jose Manuel Rodriguez Delgado, and I just wrote a paper about him that just came out like 2 weeks ago. So I continue to write on his relationship to psychosurgery. But Delgado, in this book, has this wonderful metaphor about the brain. And he goes about the brain's potentiality. It's like a beautiful highway, able to accommodate traffic and facilitate the exchange of visitors among the many cities. The highway, think about that as that network I talked about in the brain. The highway, however, cannot create cars, trucks, merchandise, businessmen and women, workers, and all the life which circulates along it. The road makes functions possible, but by itself is a useless stretch of payment. So what I'm talking about is, once the brain network is reestablished, if the network is there, it has to be activated. You've got to put commerce and trucks and merchandise and businessmen and women on that highway system for it to engage and develop commerce. And that's precisely what we did in our theory of taking what's called the meso circuit and activating it with deep brain stimulation. And I'll talk to you about that as well. And this is another response. And this was a paper that we published in Nature. And we had a patient, a single patient, 6 years post-injury, with a Glasgow Coma Scale initially of 3. And in a double-blind crossover study, we did bilateral thalamic stimulation. And here you see the electrodes going into the thalamus. It looks like we're putting a big wedge into their brain, but this is an artifact because these are metal electrodes. And at the time we were unable to do MRI because the technology did not exist yet. But with a randomly double-blind crossover study, he developed increased cognitively mediated behaviors. This man could not talk. He could only sometimes move his eyes to communicate, but intermittently. But with the deep brain stimulation, he was able to say 6 or 7 word sentences, say the first 16 words of the American Pledge of Allegiance, go to Old Navy and go shopping, and tell his mother he loved her. He had improved limb control. And for the first time in 6 years, he was able to eat by mouth and maintain his secretions. And it was the first evidence that deep brain stimulation can promote late recovery from severe TBI. And the way we wrote this, it was, progress in the face of ignorance. We were humble about it. It's the first salvo in manipulating the circuits of the brain in the service of recovery. And so all of this stuff, all of this progress, which I could have given you 3 hours worth of lecture on, coalesced in these new practice guidelines and a systematic review in September of 2018 in both neurology and the Archives of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation. So it was a joint publication, which is very unusual. So we had a systematic evidence-based review, and I would add the evidence-based review only included studies that had 20 or more patients. So all the vanguard stuff like the deep brain stimulation wasn't even included. From this data, they published practice guidelines about like what we should do, which I would argue for those of you who are interested in the litigation front of this becomes the standard of care that people should adhere to. And then I wrote a paper. I was asked to write the accompanying editorial on the ethical, palliative, and policy legal considerations related to this. And so these 3 articles, and I just have the ones from neurology, became sort of the new standard of care. And a couple things shout out from that, right? It's a landmark statement from the American Academy of Neurology, the College of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation, and the NIH Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Medicine. So there's a government element to this as well. It supplants the prior statements, but here's the paradox. It calls for standards of care, yet in doing the evidence-based review, they look back at data from the last 15 years. And what do they find? Patients got less access to rehab days. Even as the science was getting better, there was less access to care. They called for improved diagnostic accuracy, evolving treatments like amantadine, But again, there were a lot of things that didn't get to the threshold of 20 subjects. And very importantly, they called for the amelioration and prevention of confounding conditions that impinge diagnosis or kills people, like pneumonias, bed sores, urinary tract infections, and the like. They also said there's no such thing anymore as the permanent vegetative state. It's now the chronic vegetative state, because 20% of people who were thought to be permanent actually recovered. And some of those folks were misdiagnosed. Now, in bioethics land, that was a major change, because it undermined a central catechism. I know, not in a Catholic sense, but a major truth in North American bioethics in Quinlan, Cruzan, and Shivo, that once you were in a permanent vegetative state, there was no hope for recovery, because the right to die cases were predicated on permanence and irreversibility. And I think it has implications for how we think about these cases. And I want to just draw your attention to, this is Karen and Quinlan, this is Terry Shivo, but look at the tombstone, and if you can see it, I hope you can, of Nancy Cruzan, the case that went to the Supreme Court. And you see here, she's kind of like in ventricular tachycardia, then you see it, thank you, and then she's flatlined. But look at the date. She was born 1957. She departed in 1983 when she lost consciousness. So the notion that you're gone irrevocably, and then she's at peace 7 years later, kind of interesting. And it reflects the notion of once you get to this state, you're permanent. Now, let me just say that 80% of people who are in the vegetative state are permanent and they're never going to recover. So we don't want to mislead families, but 20% may actually be able to move towards the minimally conscious state. And I've written about this in great detail in the SMU Law Review, looking at a reconsideration of some of these landmark cases, like Cruzan specifically, given our evolving knowledge in disorders of consciousness. Now, okay, so that's the predicate, right? Science has changed, we have new technology, and you'd think that our laws and our legal understanding and how we treat these people would be different. So my patron saint philosopher is the American pragmatist, John Dewey, and he writes, inventions of new agencies and instruments create new ends. Think about imaging studies, EEG, all the things we're using these days, and they create new consequences which stir men and women to form new purposes. So once you know about covert consciousness, you can no longer look away. Once you know that somebody who's in the minimally conscious state can feel perceived pain, you can't not treat their pain, right? So it stirs us to new purposes. And then here, it's hard to talk about the United States Supreme Court these days, but Justice Kennedy, who wrote the majority opinion in Obergefell, which decriminalized gay marriage, wrote the following about new insights and societal understandings can reveal unjustified inequality within fundamental institutions that once passed as unnoticed and unchallenged. So I think this kind of quote, like new knowledge, makes what we used to do unacceptable. And so how we didn't interrogate the brain and we didn't look for covert consciousness, and the inequality imposed on people like Terry Wallace when he was in that nursing home and nobody knew that he was conscious, is no longer acceptable. And so that's what you would hope, right? That's what you would hope for with all this science. But at the very last meeting that I went to in person before the pandemic, just weeks before I was supposed to come to Dublin, this was in February, and I was at a conference in New Orleans, the last days of February 2020. We're talking about consciousness, we're having this meeting, and some ethicist, and I put that in quote, says, what's the moral status of consciousness? I mean, what is it worth? What does it cost? And wouldn't it be terrible if you knew how, if you were aware that you had a severe brain injury, wouldn't you rather want to be dead? Right? This was what was asked to me. And we were sort of stuck in this Kuhnian, Thomas Kuhn's book, Structure of Scientific Revolution, of a right to die generation. The right to die, the establishment of a right to die, of autonomy at life's end is so important. But we need to accommodate both the right to die and the right to care in the same space. We need a paradigm shift of this, because these attitudes, even with all this progress, these attitudes still linger. And here's some data. 31% of patients with acute traumatic brain injury die on their acute admission, but 70% of those deaths are accounted for by a withdrawal of care, a decision to withdraw care. Some of those people were going to die, but not all of them. And here's the story, trigger warning, that reflects just what's wrong with our system. So I wrote this essay in the Hastings Center report, which is our leading bioethics journal, I'd say, in the world, called When No One Notices, Disorders of Consciousness and the Chronic Vegetative State. So I wrote this article about a year after those practice guidelines came out that we just spoke about. And I said, how come no one in bioethics land is paying attention to these guidelines? But I started off by talking about not noticing something that happened in the Hacienda healthcare system in Phoenix, Arizona. The story here is a woman who was described as being in the vegetative state, was discovered one day, and this is disturbing, so I'm giving you a warning. She's screaming, and they discover that she's giving birth. And nobody knew in this nursing home that she had gained weight, that she had stopped menstruating, that she had increased abdominal girth over the preceding 9 months, and she was giving birth. So that was disturbing. That's a kind of no one noticed, a kind of neglect that's emblematic of how these people are treated. And then the other thing that's even more disturbing is how errant the diagnosis was. Because if she's screaming when she's having childbirth, she's self-aware. So she's not in the vegetative state at all. She's probably in the minimally conscious state. And now it gets even worse because they can't reliably communicate. If she was aware of childbirth, was she also perhaps aware of her sexual assault, that experience of sexual assault, which she was unable to call out and ask for help? So this was in 2019, and the nurse who was alleged was prosecuted and found guilty of sexual assault. But this is just the tragedy that we're living with. Even with our understanding of covert consciousness and like, these kinds of things can happen. One of the family members that I've been interviewing for my ongoing research said to me in July of 2018, his wife was in a minimally conscious state. And he said, human error and incompetence are going to interfere with my wife's recovery, and not the nature and the extent of her brain injury. And that is something I cannot accept. And then in October of 2018, she dies of a urinary tract infection at a hospital in New York City, not my hospital, another hospital. So, the premonition was right. So these people are incredibly vulnerable, and no one is immune to that. Even Terry Wallace, who is the face, as it were, for the minimally conscious state. And look him up, and he was in El País, he was in The Guardian, he was in the New York Times. He was a famous guy, all right? He had a notable death on the CBS morning Sunday news show here in the United States. He had an extraordinary life, all right? But he had an all too ordinary death. And his story reflects the promise and peril of brain injury. And I'm going to tell you a story I've not told publicly yet, and I have his family's permission to share this with you. This is Angela, who died in 2018. But in February, I got a call from Terry's sister about Terry was going on a ventilator, and the doctors wanted to remove it. And they couldn't imagine his was a life that was worth living, but he had a treatable pneumonia. So with our, counsel, she pushed back, and he stayed on the ventilator. But then he seemed withdrawn. And the doctors thought, he wasn't engaged, but his brain function was unchanged. He just had a heavy heart, because people who have brain injury can have a heavy heart. He was still grieving his mother, with whom he was exceedingly close to, and she died in 2018. And one of Terry's challenges was he didn't have a good sense of time. He lost his sense of temporality. So whether his mother died in 2018 or died in 2022 may not have been clearly apparent to him. And then a doctor, in a most troubling way, asked him if he wanted to be with his mother. And he said yes. And they took that as he wanted to die. His sister was alarmed. We spoke again about it. And it just, the fact was, he missed his mother. And he had a tracheostomy. He couldn't talk, so he couldn't really express himself, but he missed his mother. And he needed more care, not less care. He needed rehabilitation, which could not be met in rural Arkansas. Only place he could go to was out of state, but he was too frail to make the trip. And so they sent him to a nursing home, and he died of pulmonary complications despite their best efforts. So here we have in Terry Wallace, right, who's in the New York Times, whose JCI study was on the front page of the journal, the intersectionality, disability, cross currents of the right to die, this presumption of nihilism, poverty, there are poor people in rural Arkansas, and access to care. And these variables, which are, I'm telling an American story, but I'm sure Reinhard has a parallel, story from the Irish countryside of compounding vulnerabilities. And these folks need greater protection. They need access to care, and they need human rights protections. And I want to come around to the end of the last section of the talk, and talk about disability rights, and say this is more than an insurance issue. And I wrote this piece in the New York Times now 5 years ago, calling brain injury and the civil right we don't think about. I think the next wave of civil rights is the rights of people with severe brain injury. We have a tier system of care. These people are segregated, and I use that word in the American context. They end up in chronic care. They don't get the care they need. There's an absence of rehabilitation. They don't get their pain managed. And I think it's a violation of civil rights and disability rights, and a violation of both the Americans with Disabilities Act, excuse the oldish slide, because it's now, some 32 years, will be 32 years this July, and the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, both of which call for the maximal integration of these people into society. And that means being in the nexus of your homes and families and your communities, and to get the care you need that makes that possible. And I see this as a sequence of rights, women's rights, civil rights, gay rights, from Seneca Falls to Selma to Stonewall. Dispossessed groups had to appeal for rights enjoyed by other citizens, and the struggle continues here. And with all the discussions of diversity, equity, and inclusion that we have in the United States, we're only beginning to bring disability rights into that mix, because these are some of the most vulnerable people in the world, and actually the histories are related. The segregation of African Americans in the United States and the segregation of peoples with disabilities occurred at precisely the same era during the Jim Crow era. And we see the evolution and the intermingling of rights, the Brown v. Board decision, the Civil Rights Act, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, are all have a family resemblance. And we could say more about that. But in the interest of time, I'll just say that we had the Rehab Act of 73, which covered federal entities receiving federal assistance, to the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, which broadened it to employers, state and local government, places of public communication, telecommunications. By the way, I think that there's some legal work to be done looking at Title IV, because I don't think when they wrote this, they were thinking only about TTY for people who were deaf. I think you could say a lot of the technology that we're talking about, eye tracking devices, even deep brain stimulators and the like, if they promote communication, maybe they should be covered by the ADA. And that's going to be work that we'll continue to do. But the ADA was basically to overcome the segregation, the isolation of people with disabilities. See here, President Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, signing the ADA. And this is considered the seminal event of his administration. I mean, it may be the greatest accomplishment that he had during his 4 years in office. Now, for people who have disorders of consciousness, it's not about the cut in the sidewalk that helps people get to work, but rather, if they're in a wheelchair, it's not a motoric issue. It's about how they reestablish communication with others. And it's the reestablishing of communication reconstitutes community. They're cognates, communication and community. And I don't know how many of you know this film by Pedro Almodovar. It won the Academy Award, and it's mistranslated into English as "talk to her," but in Spanish it's "hable con ella," and it's this notion of relationality. That if we can restore communication, talk with her, we can restore relationships. And there are a number of legal tools that we have tried to use. The Olmsted argument, that is a way to enforce the ADA. And Justice Ginsburg of blessed memory said, Congress explicitly identified unjustified segregation of persons with a disability as a form of discrimination. Okay. And then the Olmstead enforcements, it's more than simply where you live, it's also how you live. And that's what we're working on. So this is a very important, court decision. Now, the work that we did, with giving this ability to a person with deep brain stimulation, the ability to communicate, we felt really good about. I did worry as I wrote about it, saying, well, what happens if he does, get the stimulator and he's disturbed by his situation? We might have created a difficult situation. We could turn it off, but it is disturbing. So I one day I read this article by Grant Gillette, who is a New Zealander neuroethicist and neurosurgeon, and he wrote The Minimally Conscious State, Deep Brain Stimulation, and What is Worse Than Futility. And being sort of Anglophilic, he got Shakespearean. There's the rub, and he said the risk of unbearable badness. He described my work as the risk of unbearable badness. That in fact, you would wake up one day and you'd see how horrible your life was, and oh my God, look what you've done. And then one day, Greg Pearson, that's the patient who had the surgery, or the subject, and his mother, who gave me permission to write about this in my book, tells me the story that one day Greg was crying. And I was, oh my God, here we go. This is my nightmare. She says he was crying one day. I was visiting him. And I said, Greg, why are you crying? And again, this is a man who could not talk before. And he says, I'm crying for Corey. I'd spent hours with him. I said, who's Corey? And she says, that's his brother. That's his brother, does not come to see him. That's in denial. And then mom says, and even I started crying, because here he is. He's aware. He knows what's going on. So what's the lesson here? The lesson is we gave him voice. The lesson is that he was able to express himself. And maybe before he had the ability to express himself, he still felt alone and isolated, but we gave him the opportunity to express his concerns. He missed his brother. He wasn't crying for himself. He's crying because he missed his brother. So there's this saying in disability rights, nothing about us without us. Nothing about us without us. And that's the title of this book, About Us, by Peter Catapano and Rosemary Garland Thompson, which was from a series of essays in the New York Times. I'm honored to be the only person without a disability included in this collection. So the work that we're trying to do up at Yale is to give voice to people with disabilities, to give them the opportunity to express themselves. And we're following a strategy based on the NAACP Legal Defense Fund that helped to end segregation in the United States. And we have this thing called CASB, the Consortium for the Advanced Study of Brain Injury, which is at Cornell and at Rockefeller University. But we have CASB at YLS at Yale. And to date, we've written 17 articles with student co-authors and colleagues trying to articulate the legal basis for integrating people, advancing the rights of people with severe brain injury. And I'll conclude with a current study that is just about to be published. We have done deep brain stimulation in patients with moderate to severe brain injury, not just patients who are in the minimally conscious state where we started, but these are patients who have, GOSI, scales of 5 to 7. These are what they call the walking wounded, people, who are fatigued and don't have motivation, and they don't have executive function. And we found, and that will be published, that it had an effect on them. And I published, I have an NIH grant, and we did extensive interviews with patients and their families. I call everybody's a subject, so subject, but patients were the subjects who got the surgery and their families before and after surgery. Why did you study? Why did you do this? Why did you enroll? How is your life different? And the like. And this will be part 1 will be forthcoming in October in Cambridge Quarterly. It was a 60-page manuscript of these narratives and this story. But one of the things that I think encapsulates the study was that one person who got the deep brain stimulator said, "I need new friends." Why? Because she had her thinking improved. She outgrew her old friends. She needed smarter friends. So the question is, when you've had this kind of transformative intervention, again, with technology funded by the Brain Initiative, right? How do we accommodate these people into society? You know, it's not just good enough to have the technology, but it's science in society. And so we just have an article under review, it's in press actually, in Boston College Law Review, where we're proposing not just the Americans with Disabilities Act, it's just a way to enforce it, but an Americans with Abilities Act. In other words, how do we accommodate improvements? So you don't have to sue because you didn't get something. How do you get something prospectively? How do we have more on souls in the world to help people recover along the way so they don't have to fight for access to that care? How do we sustain the pipeline of technology so that people can get the care they need? And fundamentally, in this new shift in my work, Reinhard, I'm moving from rights to capabilities, drawing upon the work of Amartya Sen, Martha Nussbaum, and Sridhar Venkatapuriam, where the notion is it's not just about having rights, but giving you the technologies which enables your capabilities to have human flourishing. And this will be capital intensive, but I think it's a way to sustain recoveries. So what's at stake here? Fundamental issue is conscious individuals have been ignored, sequestered, segregated. The brain can regenerate. We have to think of rehabilitation as education. How well this happens depends on the interventions and access to technology. And these folks are utterly dependent on us. Families are dependent on us to advocate for them. And the paradox is there are less protections. As you get better, you're in a less protected class as far as disability law because it's a mutable condition. So we need to let the law mature so that your protections continue and they evolve with you as you recover. My favorite sort of saying here is from Spain. They have a federation of brain injury. And up top, they say, una vida salvada merece ser vivida. A life that is saved deserves to be lived. So I will stop there. Thank all the families that consented to be interviewed with me. Thank my colleagues at Cornell, at Yale Law School. My disclosures are here. And this is a painting by Tom Matt, which shows the East River, the New York Presbyterian Weill Cornell Medical Center, and the 59th Street Bridge, made famous by Simon and Garfunkel. So I'll stop there, and I'll thank you so much for your attention, and I apologize for going a bit long. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a very enlightening presentation and raising issues that I think, as I said at the beginning, I think they should be much more widely discussed and known and referred to than they are, at least in the context that we are aware about here in Ireland. There is, as you might know, a change in legislation here that will give people with severe disabilities and issues around consciousness more rights than they have at the moment. And one of the themes that the people explaining that new legislation around the Assisted Decision Making and Capacity Act are using is what you mentioned there, on nothing about us without us. So that is, I think that's a very essential theme that should come out a bit more. I didn't see any questions in the chat. There's one, maybe. Yeah, Oren put up there that if there are any questions, if you could please ask them in the chat, or if you just want to unmute yourself and ask any questions that you might have.
With one point you mentioned, good afternoon, my name is Roland. Actually, just one quick question. When you mentioned that you don't want to mislead families, 80% conditions are permanent conditions and 20% conditions still have a lot of chance for recovery. So how to recognize these people? Who are these 20%? Is there any significant signs how to recognize them?
Right. So I think I heard the question, how do you recognize the 20% who are chronically vegetative, who actually would be at a higher functional status? So a couple of things. One is that there's a bedside exam, which is still the best way to do it, called the Coma Recovery Scale Revised. And we know that you have to do 5 exams over time to get, an accurate assessment, because if people fluctuate up and down and you get them at a down, they're going to look like they're vegetative. And if these behaviors are episodic and intermittent, you have to have an adequate sample. So that's at any, one time, like over a course of a week. You want to do 5 different exams. You want to do it at different times of the day. You want to, because they'll fluctuate based on their medications, depending on their sleep cycle and the like. Okay. So that's one thing. The other thing is, if the brain changes over time, you want to make sure that the last sort of assessment that you have is not from 5 years ago, right? Now that there's also evolving. This is not yet the standard of care, but I'd look at the 2018 guideline. Is they talk about the use of these emerging technologies to look for covert consciousness. So when there's a doubt, I think it's useful at the right place to do one of these functional imaging studies where they put you in a scanner and they ask you to imagine walking through your house or playing tennis. And you could say, imagine swimming. Like for Maggie, who I wrote about in my book, she was a swimmer. So we didn't use tennis. When we did a similar study that we published, we said, imagine swimming, because it was something that she did that we would more likely get traction on. So I think that over time, we're going to be using a technology to look for covert consciousness. The other thing that's very promising, I think, and it's more cost effective, is what Jan Clausen at Columbia has done. He's used EEG as a way to look for covert consciousness. And this was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And I think that's going to be the way this is disseminated, because EEG is a lot less costly and complicated. The problem is, and we're working on this with what's called the Curing Coma campaign, is how do you evaluate those EEGs? Because your routine neurologist is not going to be able to do that. So we need to develop algorithms to develop the technology so that it's applicable, so that a doctor in a community hospital who wants to look for this can do that, and then maybe send their EEGs to a central repository for it to be evaluated. The problem is with these EEGs and these fMRIs is that you still need expertise that is only available in research centers to make the determination, because they're still investigational. They're not yet ready for prime time in the clinic, but they're very promising. But the Coma Recovery Scale Revised, I still think is the best way to do it, and making sure you have an adequate sample. The other thing that people are doing, and this is an off-label indication, but it was proven by John White and Joe Giacino, again in a New England Journal paper, that amantadine can accelerate and restore consciousness. And you should work with your physiatrists and neurologists about proper use of that. It can also sometimes can promote seizures, so we have to be careful in patient selection. But amantadine has become an off-label use in many rehabilitation centers. I didn't entirely hear the question because it was a little bit in the background, but I hope I've answered what was the gist of that questioner's concerns. Okay, good.
Yeah, that was it here. Thank you very much. So any other questions that people might have? Yeah.
Yes.
It's from a colleague who's here from Germany, from Burga.
I'm an occupational therapist and I work with all these patients. And just one question: what do you think about the PET scans as an examination from the medicine point?
I didn't hear all that. Could you repeat it?
Yeah. There exists an examination, and this is a PET scan. They do it in the University of Augsburg in Bavaria, and there are a lot of
examinations, then they can prove if there's a way that these patients are going on. Because I think it's always a question of, therapists feel by their hand if there's a reaction from the patients, but even insurances and even doctors, I have to say, they want to have a proof if it's really like the family or the therapist says, if it is like
Right.
it is. And what do you think about the new examinations?
Well, I mean, I don't know the details of that particular investigation, but I think we do need to have proof. And I think it's dangerous to mislead families into believing something that's not true. So if somebody reacts, we need to know that it's true and it's not a reaction, and it's volitional and it reflects consciousness, and it's very, very complicated. So for example, there are patients who can respond to a command at the bedside and who are minimally conscious, who can't respond in the scanner to the functional imaging. So, imagine they can do something at the bedside, so we know they're minimally conscious. And if we say, imagine walking through your house, they can't do that. So we know the diagnosis ahead of time, but they can't. But they don't. The study isn't accurate. So the sensitivity and the specificity is not there. So I think before we start endorsing a technology that can be misleading and stigmatizing, because we can label somebody if they don't respond, right? Then they were conscious, then they're forever labeled as unconscious, right? And that could have a negative effect. So we do need to have proof. Having said that, one of the things that's really interesting about the narrative studies that I've been doing with these patients and families, for the moderate to severe brain injury, is sometimes patients or families bring things up that is hypothesis generating. And we can say, oh, well, that's really interesting. We can now study that. Some of our narratives have revealed that patients had improvements in neurofatigue, that they actually had more motivation, they were less fatigued with the deep brain stimulation. But our metrics for capturing it weren't so great the way our study was designed. So when we do a bigger study, because of my data, which is more qualitative, right, we will now have a better quantitative approach. So I think we should always listen to patients and their families. We should always use that as a way to kind of guide our inquiry. But at the same time, we don't want to prematurely release results or studies or sanction them before they're ready, because then it becomes kind of like complementary and alternative medicine, and that's not. The science is there. It may take time to prove it, but we have to go with the science.
Thank you very much.
I think Ting Ting Shum had a question as well.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much. That was so great to see all that in well, not great, but to see all that in the presentation is stuff I've read about before, and was shocked that it's not talked about more. So thank you so much for that. Thank you so much, Reinhard, for putting it together. I talked to you years ago on the phone. You were so kind to me. And I don't know if you remember, but I really, really appreciate your. Yeah. So thank you so much. It's great to be able to meet like this. Thank you for the Trojan work you're doing to put all this together. Yeah, so I was just wondering more about, and I really take your point about how important it is to make sure and to be sure. But in terms of treatment, like we were offered an opportunity to participate in like a deep brain stimulation trial when Mum when we first arrived here. I'm in Shanghai at the moment, and so the hospital here kind of offered that. We didn't know enough about it. My family were very nervous, so we didn't go for it. I didn't know the medical folks enough as well in the institution, so we didn't go for it. So I was wondering if that was 7 years ago, and I'm wondering like what you think of that. Obviously you're working with it, so has that like that method like moved on, or how safe is it? If we got that opportunity, would you recommend it again? And also, many years ago, I also read about, I think it was in San Diego or somewhere on the West Coast, where they're doing this other research with kind of like waves. I can't remember what kind of waves they are, but it's not invasive and it's like
Yeah.
ways to stimulate. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I wrote to them, and they were, unfortunately, they were not taking people at the time. But I don't know if that, and
Yeah.
he
So
said he would be,
so that
they were continuing, but I didn't hear back. So
right.
I was wondering.
That was either directed ultrasound or transcranial magnetic stimulation. Probably Martin Monti's work at UCLA, I believe, is what you were probably talking about. So
Yes.
you know the right. The challenge is, and Martin Monti was that the yes no study.
Yeah.
That was his paper. Mary Kennedy, could you go on mute if you don't mind? But that was the New England Journal study is the same person, and he's a close colleague of ours. You know, the challenge is, and I would just add the transcranial magnetic stimulation, and which is electrical, like magnetic, or the directed ultrasound, both target the thalamus, where the deep brain stimulation targets, except it's less specific because the sound waves are more are less, you know, specifically targeted. I would just say, having gone through this last study where we had 6 patients implanted and one had to be explanted because of infection, it is incredibly complicated to find the right target. I mean, we know we have a theoretical target that we believe is the right target in the intralaminar nucleus of the thalamus. Have the right surgeon, neurosurgeon, have the right patient selection. So I can't comment, you know, and the fact that somebody can put an electrode in someone's brain, they do that for Parkinson's, you know, the technology, the ability to do it is there. Whether they do it correctly or, you know, I can't endorse that. I can't give you medical advice, obviously, for your family member, but you know, it's still experimental, and it really depends on the quality of the investigative team and you know, who's funding it. You know, like here, the imprimatur of the National Institutes of Health, the Brain Initiative of the United States, gives you a sense that it's been peer reviewed by the best scientists in the world. I don't know of the quality in other jurisdictions, and so I would say it's important to be cautious, but if you can you know, find investigators who are reputable, have published in premier medical journals, that gives you a sense, a flavor of the quality of their work. You know, peer review is so important here. You know, the vulnerability of families who are, you know, looking for a cure, looking to, you know, something that will help get them out of such a difficult circumstance. Desperation makes people very vulnerable. So I think you have to be, you know, very cautious. You know, you don't want to harm people. You don't want to harm your loved ones. And in fact, the ethical trajectory of our work, we started in the minimally conscious state patient because patients who were vegetative didn't have networks to activate, right? We talked about needing a network. So we went to the lowest functional status, the minimally conscious state, to establish proof of principle, because the incremental harm was going to be less than if we did it in someone who had moderate to severe brain injury, because there you could actually do damage and make them worse. Once we established that it could be done and it was useful in the minimally conscious state, it was done safely, we've now moved up to moderate to severe brain injury. It was ethically proportionate. So I think, you know, you have to be, you know, very cautious, very thoughtful. Look for people that have published, have the recognition of their peers. There are a lot of people who will take this technology prematurely and just try to do it in a kind of potentially dangerous way. And that's why I wrote about that little article about Delgado and Walter Friedman. And, you know, I think the legacy of psychosurgery is in the background, because we don't want to jeopardize our possibility of making progress by having a catastrophe somewhere. And I think it's very important. So, you know, one of the, you know, ethical, you know, virtues, one of the cardinal virtues is prudence and being careful. So again, looking for investigators that have that are with excellent universities, that have had, you know, funding from international or revered agencies, that have been publishing in leading journals are all biomarkers, as it were, of credibility. And then you have to make a judgment about whether it's the right intervention, for a particular family, patient and family. Very complicated. In our study, to do 6 people, we had 419 people who were screened before we got to 6. Some of those people were just not appropriate. So it's also in patient selection. It's incredibly important. And so it's a very complicated thing. And this is why, I don't know, Ms. Shum, I guess, why it's so important that we have rights and we have improved access, so that if we develop something that is promising, it can be disseminated quickly, and we don't have to wait 10 or 20 years before it's available as a therapy. On the other side, we don't want to prematurely offer something that's not ready therapeutically and cause harm and set the field back, because we can't do that. We had a thalidomide kind of situation. We can't sustain those disasters. Does that help a bit?
Yes, that does help. Thank you. That's like really pragmatic, as in, yeah, it's more than just, does this work? Because it's still all being investigated. It's also who's doing it and the context and all the wider considerations.
Right.
Thank
And
you.
the criteria for working are, they have to be, credible. It's not just, well, I think it's better. What are the metrics? And so it's a real question. And if you want to read about the Delgado-Friedman distinction, there's a passage in that paper where, and this is people who worked in the mid-century, where Jack Pressman, who's a historian of psychosurgery, distinguished John Fulton, who was a neurophysiologist who was laboratory based, with Walter Friedman, and Walter Friedman, who was the lobotomist, the egregious lobotomist, he said, he would say, it worked. He would pronounce that it worked as if that was true, whereas we need biomarkers and evidence that things work. So it's a complicated space, but I hope I've helped to clarify it a little bit.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Joe. Are there any other questions? Even if there are, I wanted to ask a question.
Sure.
Doesn't have to be the last one if you have the time, but families here have been told repeatedly things like, face up, what your son or your daughter or your family member needs is nutrition, hydration, and medication. That's it. Or they have been told, that in a health system that has limited resources, and while we understand your own personal tragedy, you have to recognize that that health system has to focus its resources on people that have a reasonable chance of a meaningful recovery. So they're all things that, in my mind, would not go well with the idea that even people in a minimally conscious state or with reduced consciousness have a right not just to life, but to life and living with that condition and being integrated and taking part in society and in life. So what is required is, you've talked a lot about the science and the research and the technology, but I think, could it be that there is, we know, or people who want to know about this, they can find out, but they're not doing it or they don't believe it. So I think maybe what is also required is deep cultural change and how people see severe acquired brain injury and the people who have suffered that injury. What do you think has to happen? You mentioned a few examples there. The gay marriage, to education for Black people, to women who didn't have the right to vote. And they were all popular, big movements who changed the landscape. So what do you think needs to happen to change the landscape for people with severe acquired brain injuries and their families?
Well, I think Hy Feldblum, who was one of the architects of the Americans with Disabilities Act, talks about the circle of legislative advocacy. And I think we really need to align ourselves with the DEI movement, you know, the diversity, equity, and inclusion movement, which is a very potent and powerful force, at least in American politics, and I suspect worldwide, Black Lives Matters and the like, that we need to have disability rights as one of those elements. Because if we can ride that wave, which is bigger than our wave, we'll get further than we will by ourselves. And she talked about the coalition that led to the passage of the ADA in 1990 was a coalition of people coming together, not saying my disability is worse than your disability or my problem is, you know, everybody realized they had a common cause. And that led to its, you know, passage. There was enough political movement there. I think, you know, we are in such denial about disability. You know, 40% of us will be disabled before we die, other than our, you know, acute dying process. You know, so it's probably the experience that almost half of us will experience, but we're terrified of it. And so, you know, patients, we don't want to imagine ourselves having a brain injury. We also think that we can prevent this from happening, right? So somebody rolls into the emergency room, they've had a brain injury, and everybody wants everything done, right, to save their loved one's life. It's only normal, right? And we dichotomize outcomes. And we think about it, I'll have an advanced directive, I won't allow my, you know, I won't ever get that way. But then they get a little better, they get a little better. And instead of getting fully better, they end up halfway better. But we don't think halfway. We all think of halfway because we deal with halfway all the time, right? And so there's a lot of cultural education that needs to happen. We need to overcome our denial. We have to develop alliances. We also need to tell stories of success. And that's why I've been doing this for 25 years. You know, and it's frustrating how many times I have to say the same thing over and over and over again. It's just incredible. And it's remarkable how biased. Like, I think one of the major things we have to overcome in the United States is this legacy. And this was my little, you know, discovery conceptually about how the right to die, which was good, had this unintended consequence of nihilism about brain injury. That was such a powerful force, the right to die, all those cases. And to sort of retweak that and say, yeah, but that was good, but look at, there was a downside to that we now think that all people with brain injury, you know, should die or could die, or, you know, they have a life that's not worth living. You know, like, for example, I'm on the ethics committee of the American College of Physicians, which is a leading internal medicine group in the United States. And we have an ethics manual. It gets published every, you know, gets revised every 3 to 4 years or something. And the vegetative state stuff was in the right to die section. I said, why don't we have a section on brain injury? It doesn't need to be part of the right to die movement. It's related, but why are you putting it there? Because you put it there, you've equated it with that. So I think there's a lot of like education. The good news is, I think, you know, like up at Yale, you know, I'm training all these lawyers. They're going to get out there. They're going to become advocates. Medical students are beginning to learn about this stuff. The curriculum is changing. There's the Curing Coma campaign, which is part of the Neurocritical Care Society, which I'm on the advisory board of. So there's a lot of progress, and the science will win the day. I mean, the science will win the day. We just hope that things get publicized and gets into the public consciousness. It's a very complicated story. And, I had, been writing for years, and I wrote my book. It's okay, now I put everything that I know into this book, right? And what happens after you write a book? You got to write articles about the book so people will read the book. It's like painting a bridge. You got to, once you've painted it, you got to go back and paint it again. And it seems like, we're kind of like 20 years behind autism. as far as public consciousness, as far as people understanding the importance of this. But I'm not discouraged because I've seen some pretty remarkable things happen over the last, couple of decades. And I think we need to, get media coverage. We need to have allies. We need to get celebrities who care about this, a celebrity who has a family member with brain injury or somebody who had a brain injury who's recovered. I mean, Bob Woodruff of ABC News, who, sat in that very chair, and I talked to him, he's back reporting. We need to celebrate those successes because I still think that people think, you've had a brain injury and you're never coming back, you're never going to get better. And that's just not true. There are things that we treat in medicine that are far more hopeless than brain injury. And we spend lots of money on some cancers, for example, that are terminal. We spend a lot of money on that, but we don't do it for brain injury. And brain injury is the leading cause of disability in young people. Also, I think we also need to better characterize brain injury. There was a report from the National Academy of Sciences just about 6 weeks ago, which you can get online, and National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine, saying, we need better classifications, better than moderate, severe, mild, moderate, and severe. And now there is an ICD code for the minimally conscious state. So we need better metrics to track these things. If we don't measure it, we don't know what the need is. And we still don't know what the prevalence is of people with minimally conscious state is. We don't have data. So we need to step up and look for alliances. One of the things that I try to do is that Americans tend to be a little overly, not overly, properly concerned about veterans who served in the war and people who might be politically disinclined to spend money on social services might be inclined to spend it on veterans. So you try to say, okay, we have all these veterans from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, who the brain injury was the signature injury of those wars because of the improvised explosive devices. So you try to create an alliance between the civilian sector and the former soldiers who have brain injury, and you try to put that together. But mostly it's, this, nobody wants to hear about it. This is an unpleasant topic. And there are other things that compel us in the news. Again, racism, women's right to choose. These are topics that are critically important. And our topic, doesn't get the same kind of coverage because in many ways, it seems to be less pressing. But if you have a family with brain injury, it is the thing that's most important to you, and it affects your choices and your lives. So, I think in the Western world, at least, we have enough resources to pay for a number of causes, and this needs to be one of them. So I think, I see behind you, Reinhard, leave no one behind. And I'll conclude with a little story, which links up with the veteran story. I was giving a talk in Pennsylvania years ago, and it was in the congressional district of a congressman who was in charge of the defense veterans committee or something, and it was a brain injury conference, and I gave a talk. Maybe the great grandfather of the talk you heard this morning, like an earlier version of it, or grandmother. And at the end of the talk, a guy in the back raises his hand, and he thanked me for all that I had done. And he was blind, and he had dark glasses on, and it turned out he had been a soldier, a ranger in Iraq or Afghanistan, I don't remember which. And I had started my talk about the very theme: leave no one behind. And I talked about my father, who's passed away 5 years ago at 93, but he was a World War II combat medic, And the medal that he was most proud of was the combat medic badge, which was a litter, you know, like a stretcher. And it was a metaphor for, you go out, you don't leave anybody on the battlefield, you bring everybody back, leave no one behind. And so I said, not only leave no one behind, let's leave no brain behind. Let's look for the residual capacity in those brains, and let's not leave them behind. So the guy asked me this question, and I, you know, responded, and then I went back at the coffee break, which I wish we had a coffee break here, because this is virtual. We don't have coffee breaks, because then you'd have more conversation. So I went to the back and I started talking to him, and he thanked me for all that my colleagues and I were doing. And I said, you know, don't thank me. I want to thank you for your sacrifice in being in the military. And he said, well, if I can't thank you, let me thank your father. And that was a war at that point, which was like 60 years earlier. So I told that to my father, and you know, he was driving me to the train station one day, and he welled up, you know, in tears, because somebody, you know, thanked him across the generations. And I think, you know, this sense of fidelity and obligation needs to be generalized, and people need to understand how hard it is. I spent a lot of time with families with brain injury, talking to them, interviewing them, hearing their stories. And I don't think the average person understands just how hard it is to be, you know, a loved one of somebody who has a brain injury, to miss them, to want them to return, to want them to get better, to know that maybe there are things out there that can help them, but they don't have access to that. That should be the fight of our lives. And that's what we try to do here at CASB, and that's, I know what you do at Saol, and that's why, you know, I'm really honored to be part of it. And even though I've never been to Dublin, I feel part of it. But hopefully that will change one day.
Yeah, I think that's a good final word, and you know, we hope to see you here at the latest next year,
Okay.
at the next forum in summer school, and in person, and we will have not just one coffee, but hopefully a few, and
Okay. Irish coffee, I think, right?
yes, Irish coffees, yes, yes. Well, you know, I have been deeply moved by what you have said, several aspects of it, and the work that you're doing, your colleagues are doing, is so important. And I think your talk at least gave me, and I think other people here too, the motivation and the focus to continue with what we are doing, and to make sure that more people become aware of people with brain injury and their needs and their presence, really, you know. So thank you very much, Joe, for your time, your morning, our afternoon. It was a absolutely motivating and brilliant talk, and so informative. And we will make it available online next week, so that people can listen back to you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, and have a good day.
You too. All the best. And thank you everybody for attending this morning.